And now I'm going to introduce Elizabeth, who is a former student of Dr. Martinez, and I understand he was one of your academic mentors. So to introduce Dr. Martinez.
Thank you. Annyeonghaseyo. Bienvenidos. It is my privilege to introduce Dr. Ruben Martinez, who was my mentor, I won't tell you how many decades ago. I was completing my bachelor's in sociology after taking a 8-year time off. I was a returning non-traditional student, and I found hope and inspiration from my professor and my mentor. So if there is any remnant of radicalism in me, I blame it on Ruben. And I hope that it's there. My beloved Tim and I returned home to Flint 6 years ago to be with family. And I never imagined that I'd have the opportunity to reconnect with my mentor. And so I'm very honored to introduce to you Dr. Ruben Martinez, whose own life journey has informed his thinking and his work, his very fine work and contributions to our world.
Buenas tardes. It's good to be here in Flint. I come here about 3 or 4 times a year. I run the Julian Samora Research Institute at Michigan State University, which I present to people as a Latino think tank, because that's what we do. We're a Latino-focused research institute, and some of our publications are in the back over there, so please help yourself to them. And so as part of that, I do a little bit of outreach and visit communities, and I've got some friends that I met here some years ago, Rafael, Sisto, and some others, and it's good to also see some familiar faces. Donna, who was over at MSU with us, and of course Bob and Elizabeth. I was giving a talk, and I don't know why people say I'm a radical or a revolutionary. I just speak the truth. That's my job, right? I'm a sociologist. My job is to study society and to tell you what I see. And so I was in Saginaw giving a talk, a revolutionary talk, and I looked out in the audience and I said to myself, I think I know that woman. This is like, Latinos, other communities of color, we're, in terms of understanding things and seeing things, we're very context bound, right? So we see things in their context. So if you remove them from that context and look at them in abstraction, much like what Western instrumentalism does, American society, European society, and so forth, they're very abstract. We're not. We're very context. So when I looked at her, I said, well, where do I know this woman from? And anyway, I didn't really was sure that it was her until I had given my talk, and then she came up and said hello. So it's been great to reconnect with her here. I want to thank Bob for giving me the opportunity to visit with you this evening. I know that long before the lead poisoning catastrophe that occurred here, the communities of Flint have been working together to rebuild themselves, to rebuild Flint, and of course to rebuild the economy for its people. And I have been to some meetings and have heard some of the discussions, and I really appreciate what the communities here are doing, and I appreciate what Bob does in convening and assisting the community find its way to a better place. This evening I'm going to be talking about, as I said, my understanding of racism in America, and try to shed light where I think possibilities exist for a better order. If anything, we can have a conversation about possibilities. To begin with, it's important that we understand things historically, right? Because it's all about the unfolding of history, or if you're familiar with the new conception of time, the unfolding of time. There's actually a new physicists today are thinking of time completely differently than some of the previous thinkers who had made the great impact, like Einstein and others, and then as we see time unfolding, and not as an abstraction that can be mathematically represented, which is what Einstein and others were doing. Although they were able to grasp many aspects of it, I think this is a better conception of it. But to understand racism, we have to understand it on the plane where it exists. And that is, racism is first and foremost a group phenomenon. It exists at the level of the group, has its primary dynamic there, and it occurs through culture, through institutions, organizations, and then through the intergroup relations that take place. It is always primarily a group phenomenon. And we are part of it because all of us are part of members of groups. And we give it life through our actions, we reproduce it, we change it, we shape it, and so forth in our own way. But we never transform it as individuals, and it isn't, if you change an individual, you're not going to change racism because it occurs at the level of the group. So if you want to have an impact on it, if you want to end it, you have to address it at the institutional level, which is the level of the group. Secondly, racism here in this country and everywhere where it exists must be understood historically. That is, how it unfolds over time and the different forms and shapes that it takes. And it's our task to understand the form that it has taken during our lifetime. And in fact, some of us are a little long in the tooth, so it's actually changed during our lifetime. And young people have been born into it and see it as the only form in which that it exists. But much like society, it has changed during their lifetime, and we're influenced by it, we reflect it, and like I said, to some extent we can influence it and shape it, or at least influence those around us so that larger numbers can influence it. This evening what I want to talk about is the shift in the form of race relations in this country. And I will contextualize the contemporary forms, the ones in which we live, within the rise of what I call free market fundamentalism. And another word for it is neoliberalism. How many of you have heard the term neoliberalism? Okay, so I hope all of you know what it is, right? I'm still struggling to understand it. So it is, the contemporary form of race relations in our country today occurs within the rise of the philosophy and practices and policies of free market fundamentalism. And I'll speak more on that as my presentation unfolds. But because free market fundamentalism is primarily an economic class struggle, when we bring race into it, we must see it as they're interconnected. Today they like to talk about intersectionality, which for me doesn't kind of capture what I would see as the forms by which race and class combine together to give it a certain kind of trajectory. Intersections for me are sort of crossings where you can have decisions about moving in this direction. I think what they really mean is the combination of it, but perhaps they don't prefer the term combination. So first of all, speaking on just the level of racism itself, during my lifetime, that is, someone who grew up in the 50s, came of some political age in the 1960s, late 1960s, and of course in the 70s, I have seen racism change from what we call overt forms of racism to covert forms. Okay? That is, open racism where you could there are no public accommodations allowing members of minority groups to access them. There was open denigration in public, all of that kind of stuff, and hangings not only in the South but also in the Southwest and so on. So you had the very violent forms. Those were what we would call the pre-civil rights forms of racism. And then the civil rights comes along, doesn't transform them entirely, but over a period of time does allow the transformation or make for the transformation of policies and so forth, which leads us to what we would call the post-civil rights movement, right? And we need to understand what that really means. What is it, a post-civil rights context? The civil rights movement engenders, a backlash. Racism in and of itself is a struggle between groups. It just happens to have a particular ideology in which one group defines itself as superior, defines the other as inferior, and basically creates the institutional practices by which to exclude the other one and privilege themselves to whatever they can get in larger society. The civil rights movement engendered a backlash. Some of you remember the busing and all of the other kinds of things that took place. But over time once the policies were in place and there were punitive measures that were imposed on people who misbehaved, if you will, over time gave rise to what we call covert forms of racism, hidden forms of racism, so that nobody's calling you dirty names or bad names and so forth. They're just very quietly excluding you from full participation in society, and you know not where those things are happening because they don't need to denigrate you in order to continue to take advantage of the privileges that they're reserving for themselves. So we have a shift from these overt physical forms of racism to these covert forms, and what I would call the coded language of racism, right? So with the rise of free market fundamentalism, one of the basic principles was to eliminate social programs. And they did it on the basis of saying that we've got to get rid of these welfare queens. Well, actually, the woman who was actually called the welfare queen was a white woman who learned how to take advantage of the system and was actually taking in hundreds of thousands of dollars. That was the welfare queen. But over time, that was actually used for women of color to say, now we can talk about welfare queens, but we really know who we're talking about, right? We're talking about these families of color who are just living off of the public troughs and not contributing anything back to society. And this language, today there are scholars who talk about this language as a form of dog whistle politics, right? Does everyone understand what dog whistle politics is? It's really, there's a dog whistle that humans cannot hear, but the dog hears it, right? So you can blow into this whistle and he won't hear it, but my dog will, and he'll come running over to me, okay? So when they talk about dog whistle politics, they're talking about this coded language that when they use it, most of us don't get it, but it resonates with the sentiments of the target audience that they are directing it toward, right? So we've got this dog whistle politics going on. It's now an institutionalized form of communication, and it basically, gives life to this shift from a behavioral, violent form of racism to what I would call today the rise of colorblind racism, right? There's sort of this view that if we just don't see race, somehow racism will go away, right? Which is the silliest thing I've ever known, because how can I, first of all, deny your physical attributes, either as a woman or a person of color? I don't need to define you as inferior to recognize that you are a woman or to recognize that you are Native American, right? It's not the recognition of your physical attributes that makes racism or sexism. It's the denigration of the characteristics that makes the ism come to life, right? So we've seen this shift. Now, along with that, we had this rise of right-wing political philosophy. In the 1920s, we saw the rise of socialism in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, and then we saw the rise of the Soviet Union. And we had some Austrian economists who tried to come to grips with the notion of a planned economy, right? And they tried to come to grips with, can you really plan production in a way that meets demand to avoid underproduction and overproduction and so forth, and still allow for innovation, right? And they couldn't come to grips with it. And ultimately, they began to move toward a political philosophy that said that the invisible hand of the economy is the best tool. It's kind of interesting because nobody's ever seen the invisible hand, right? And it's actually just a tool that we've constructed to talk about the free market. And in fact, there are no free markets. All markets are structured and to some extent regulated. So this notion of the invisible hand regulating supply and demand is just sort of ideology or myth, because we have a lot more going on in markets than that. But we saw this rise from these Austrian scholars who basically began to argue that planned economies and so forth were stifling the individual spirit, and that collectivism was overwhelming the individual, and that we had to restore a structure of society in which the individual was the primary unit, and that collective ideas should basically be banned. Ultimately, they had influence. We would go from von Mises to Hayek. Hayek was then the sort of the right-wing scholar who debated Keynes when the Great Depression took hold and so forth, and Keynes basically won that debate, saying that when the capitalist economy has these downturns, government can serve a positive function by stimulating the economy and putting it back on track. Not unlike what happened with the financial crisis of 2007-2008, when we bailed out incompetent leaders in the industry, whichever industry you want to talk about, whether it be finance, whether it be the auto industry and so forth. I mean, can you imagine flying your private jets or your company jets over to DC to ask for money when America is suffering this great crisis? It's amazing.